afternoon. I'm Courtney Bailey with Leadership Austin.
And I'm Trenzio Turner with Austin PBS.
So welcome to this month's Engage panel on human trafficking in our region. Before we get into the discussion, let's define what we're actually talking about. So human trafficking involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sex act. As mentioned earlier, there are 313,000 victims of human trafficking in the state of Texas. This includes about 79,000 youth and children who are trafficked for sex and 213,000 adults who are trafficked for labor.
In addition to the significant human toll, human trafficking also has a major impact on our state's economy. An estimated $6.6 billion is spent on the lifetime cost of providing care to victims and survivors of minor and youth sex trafficking in Texas. Additionally, traffickers exploit approximately $600 million per year from victims of labor trafficking in our state.
Now, to be clear, this is not only a national and state problem, it's a local problem too. You may have even noticed signs like this one in the Austin airport or other parts of our city, and that's why we're having this discussion today.
Absolutely. So now let's get to the discussion. Joining us today is Becky Austen. She is the Lighthouse Director for Allies Against Slavery.
And next we have Brooke Groner-Robb. She is Assistant Attorney General with the Texas Attorney General's Office.
And finally, we have Sophia A Strother, CEO and owner of L2E Industries and lived experience expert in human trafficking. Welcome, everyone.
So, Sophia, I want to start with you. You're considered a survivor and someone who has lived through being trafficked. Would you mind sharing your story with us and explaining what does being a survivor mean to you?
Thank you again, Courtney. It's an honor to be with you all today and to be able to just continue to shed some light on a very serious issue that's affecting all social economic categories that we have in our community. Mine actually started, and I like to talk about the intersectionality normally of child abuse or child sexual assault that can then lend your way to be more vulnerable to that life or to being in that life. And so for myself, mine started at the age of 9, where my father actually started to sexually molest me and introduced me to pornography as a means of control. No spiritual compass. We didn't go to church. I was the only child, very ostracized from my mom's family as we were living in Massachusetts. And so again, no real compass. But he really molded me and groomed me to believe that my body was no more than a tool to be used at a man's discretion. That actually went on for about 2 years where he carried on a sexual relationship with me. And then unfortunately, he died abruptly in a car accident in 93. And that actually kind of sent my mother down a very spiral effect of drugs to cope with that grief. And she ultimately decided that I would be a part of that drug addiction. And so she started to groom me when we moved to Texas in a small town called Marlin, Texas. And so she started to groom me and then basically started to traffic me from the age of 13 until unfortunately I was taken advantage of by one of her dealers and became a mom at the age of 15. And thankfully, I had a grandmother, my father's mother, that was still in Massachusetts that got me out of it. I asked for her to send for me because I just knew that my future was either going to be I'm going to be dead or I'm going to be a prostitute or just there was just no hope. I didn't really see where I'd have much hope for my future. And so October 21st, 1995, my grandmother sent for me and at the time my 3-month-old son to go live with her. And that's how I ultimately got out the life of being trafficked. However, that did not end decades of entering into domestic violent relationships, also being sexually assaulted again, numerous times outside of that. I think about 36 is when I really got to my rock bottom, my low, where I just didn't want to be here. I just felt like even though I might have had some success on the career path, just all of my interactions were very transactional. I didn't even really know my name. I felt that my name was currency because that's what my mom had really flipped my identity to, is being looked at and bartered as currency. And so it wasn't until I was really almost 36 that I started to go to counseling and realize that I'm more than what happened to me. I'm more than my circumstance, and that I could really use my voice in some of the circles to be a conduit for other whispers that are out there, as I always say, that are especially women of color, because unfortunately we are the most affected by domestic violence and human trafficking as juveniles, for sure. And then about 40% for adults. And unfortunately, that representation is not there and not very visible when you see healthy survivors or even some of the providers that we come across. And so surviving for me now is thriving, so that there might be other girls or even young boys that are in the life can see that they can come out and be healthy and have good relationships that aren't all consuming. And then it also means just kind of being a voice at the table, because again, that's not historically been the case. And so that's basically a little bit of my story and what being a survivor means to me.
Thank you for sharing your story and being here, Sophia.
Thank you.
Becky, can you tell us about your work with Lighthouse and how data and technology is being used to address human trafficking?
Certainly. And again, just like Sophia, I'm really grateful to be here and be a part of this panel today. So I work on a platform called Lighthouse. It's a software and data platform that we developed at Allies Against Slavery to help identify victims of human trafficking, to help coordinate care among agencies that are working with victims and survivors, and to gain insight from data. I'm going to use the example of the pandemic because we've all lived through that. Imagine over the last 2 years, how much data you've seen that has informed you, has informed governments, has informed countries, policymakers about how to understand and respond to the pandemic. You see information about cases and vaccines and hospitalizations and surges and declines and all of that. And, all of that has affected how people and systems respond to the pandemic. So you think about the problem of human trafficking, and we haven't had that kind of data. We haven't had access to data that is current and integrated and meaningful in a way to address the problem and really to combat it. And so that's really the purpose of the work that we do. It's our North Star to really understand the data and collect it and visualize it in a way that gives it meaning, so that we then can either take action or advise those who have the ability to take that action. They can drive policy or budget or other decisions to address the issue. It's a really powerful tool, and we're about 3 years in right now in a partnership with the Governor's Office Child Sex Trafficking team to develop this statewide data platform for human trafficking. We've collected data from a lot of different sources and visualized it, and we're starting to be able to ask questions about more of the why. We understood some of the what and the where before, but now it's more like, well, why is that happening? Why is the percent of ads that people post online for sex higher in Austin relative to the population than Dallas or Houston, even though Dallas and Houston have higher populations? Why are the number of arrests for trafficking offenses relatively low compared with the arrests for sexual assault or pornography or prostitution or other related charges? Why, do we see different percentages or different trends in different parts of the state? How do we get underneath that, and how do we take action around it?
Well, thank you for that. So it feels like a full circle approach versus just one piece.
Right.
Thank you, Becky.
So some people who have experienced human trafficking have said it's challenging to be protected by the system because government officials, police, and those in positions of power sometimes benefit and profit from trafficking. Brooke, what's currently being done to create accountability and address corruption?
So I think there's a few things that Texas is doing to address those issues. The first is a broad prevention effort, like getting the word out about trafficking so that trafficking victims can self-identify and can have the resources to report. Second, I think by using three branches of government, three levels of government, right? We have locals involved, we have state investigators involved, and we have federal investigators involved. Perhaps more in trafficking than any other offense. We are using both local, state, and federal investigators to really get at the heart of what's going on, to really investigate those offenses. That means that if you are a victim and you are concerned about the local sheriff or the local judge or someone, you have other options to report to. You can report to the state, you can report to the federal. So that's another thing that's in place to try to deal with public corruption and accountability. And then the third thing Texas is doing that we were first in the nation to make sex buying a felony offense. So now the offense of buying sex is a felony. We are really taking a swing at demand because we believe that we cannot stop sex trafficking until we look at the demand. And so since that was enacted in September of 2021, there have been over 1,000 people arrested for soliciting sex in the state of Texas. And I think that's a real something to really be proud of, that we are taking that step towards ending sex trafficking by looking right at the demand.
Thank you for that. I actually have a follow-up. So
Sure.
we said accountability and corruption for those in power, but how does that translate in building the trust with the individuals who are trafficking, who may still feel a little
Sure. I mean, and I think that's why we have to show to Texas, to the world, to our local communities, that this is a issue that is being fought on all fronts, that is being fought by the local, is being fought by the state, and is being fought by the feds. So that if you are concerned about a local, you have other law enforcement that you can turn to. The other thing that Texas is doing is a care coordination effort. And I think that's another way that we are trying to get the word out about trafficking so that victims can self-identify and they can find other people in their community other than law enforcement who are working in that area. So we have nonprofit groups that are working in trafficking fields that are connected to law enforcement. So if a victim outcries to a nonprofit or a therapist first, that therapist and nonprofit are connected to the trafficking community and can help find that right place for reporting, so that it doesn't feel like you're reporting in room B of what happened in room A. There's a variety of places that report can go, so that you don't feel like you're making it straight to the law enforcement officers who abused you. The other thing we're doing is a ton of training of law enforcement. Lots of training to make sure that when law enforcement encounters a victim, they respond in a way that's appropriate given the victim's trauma, that is informed about the victim's response, and that takes into account what the victim wants to happen with that case, what the victim wants to have happen next.
Thank you for elaborating on that, Brooke.
Of course.
And I just want to remind our audience that if you have questions for our panelists, please send those in the chat. We'll be glad to share them with the panel. And this next round of questions will be open to all three of you. So anyone feel free to chime in on these next round of questions. What are signs that someone is being trafficked, and how are these individuals isolated from society? What are some of the signs that people can look out for?
I can start with that one. One of the challenges about working in this space is that oftentimes there aren't signs that an individual is being trafficked. We've seen data that said that 88% of survivors encountered professionals who could have helped them and weren't aware that they were being trafficked. So you imagine these are, folks, school teachers or counselors, folks that work in the medical profession, folks that work in victim services and law enforcement, among victims of trafficking and not knowing that those individuals are being exploited. So we use things like screening tools to help identify some of the indicators or risk factors that show up for individuals who are trafficked. There may not be physical indicators unless that individual has been physically abused. And so it's more about certain behavioral aspects, or maybe they're missing school, or maybe they're showing up with multiple cell phones, which would be unusual versus just having one. None of these things directly say, hey, that person is being trafficked, but these are risk factors that if they do show up in certain combinations, are red flags to indicate that somebody may be exploited. And a lot of times it's what Brooke said, it's training people so that they really understand the right kind of questions to ask. You're not going to ask, hey, are you being trafficked? But you may be asking, hey, are you safe? And what does safety mean to you? And let's talk about that. And let's talk about who you're with and how you're getting your basic needs met. That, those kinds of questions may help to uncover it.
Speaks to the importance of us being proactive in this sort of versus trying to wait and catch something. All right, thank you very much.
So we do have an audience question and a follow-up on what you said about training, Becky, and I think you touched on it, Brooke. So Terry St. John asks, have you created training programs for potential victim identifiers for the general public to look for?
So yes, the Texas Attorney General's office on our website has a video called Be the One. It is a hour-long video with several stories of trafficking and several key things to look for, ways to make reports, things that you should know about sex and labor trafficking. So I highly recommend that. There's also a training program that we just started implementing in January, which is for all hotel employees. The legislature said that every hotel employee in their first within the next year have to be trained on trafficking. And so also on our website are a bunch of training programs for hotel employees that I think could also work for if the public wanted to view them, to realize some signs to look for trafficking and some ways to report if you see something that you suspect could be trafficking.
Thank you for that, Brooke. So I want to switch gears and talk about policies. So what policies and laws are currently working to combat human trafficking, and which ones are creating more barriers? Sophia, you want to start with that?
I believe that Brooke touched on it earlier in regards to Texas being the first state to actually make it a felony to solicit sex. One of the things when I spoke in front of Congress in 2019, and I was just kept saying, can you see me? And one of the things that kept resonating is that we do so much discipline and or consequential action against the supply, which are the women and men that are trafficked and or again abused, but rarely do we do anything to those soliciting sex, those actually orchestrating the human trafficking rings, or even recruiters, because you have to have those three elements of force, fraud, and coercion in order to have it be something to stand in court. However, we know that it may not necessarily be that you can supply all of those things, but this was a really great step in getting to that. And that is, again, holding people accountable that are soliciting for sex, especially when it comes to juveniles. It's amazing to me that the FBI had a survey out stating that over 50% of juveniles that are arrested for prostitution are African American. But I'm still resonating. How can you be underage and be, a willful participant in prostitution? But then it goes to what Becky said about having people that even self-identified. I did not realize that I was trafficked until I was in my 30s, because I learned what the definition was. I was like, oh, wait a minute. Oh, my mother was my pimp. Like, I never put two and two together. Why? Because we have a society that even in media, movies and music kind of glorify being a pimp. You have particular figures that are very prominent in the music industry and or movie industry that have prided themselves on being pimps. We have, again, this culture that really doesn't bring weight enough to the fact that it's not okay, or to educate really what it is. Sex for survival, the same thing. There's women that say, well, no, I wasn't trafficked. I knew what I was doing. I had to eat. I needed to get a roof over my head. There were things that I did this because I needed to live, not realizing that when you have to feel obligated to give of yourself in that way in order to live, that's a form of trafficking. So one of the biggest barriers, unfortunately, and it's beyond kind of policy, is the fact that people don't know what they don't know. They don't realize that they're being trafficked or that they're even a victim, or they've been so brainwashed through the process that there'll be retaliation or there's some type of fear that they don't help law enforcement or the judicial system once they do come out. They just kind of want to go on to their lives. So I think as far as barrier policy wise, it's just more so the fact that we have to get more states on board to realize that this should be a felony. It shouldn't be just Texas, because it's not just happening in Texas. So you really need more states to actually take a proactive approach. And even how we talk about those that are enduring trafficking, they're not prostitutes. They're being trafficked. They're victims. And so like even kudos when they did the bust, I believe it was in Florida, Robert Kraft was involved with it, going into the massage parlor, and they did the bust. The prosecutor there was very careful not to call those women prostitutes. He called them victims. And I think a lot of it is around the language and how we treat those that are affected by this, them being able to self-identify will be another thing. But it all comes down to what Brooke is saying. It comes down to the training and the awareness. We have to train so that we can break a stigma and a cycle that's been going on. If we want to be honest, America has been a part of human trafficking since its inception. It's the most egregious and long-term form of labor and sex trafficking, period. So like it takes a little bit for you to break down that stigma when it's literally was ingrained in the fabric of the making of America, human trafficking.
Thank you, Sophia. Brooke or Becky, any policies or laws that you want to highlight?
Well, I would say one of the challenges that I think is a national challenge is social media. We have a number of, especially when we're talking about sex trafficking of children, a lot of sex trafficking of children is happening online.
Yes.
And online is harder to detect, harder to find. There are few laws about that require social media platforms and apps to be proactive in examining their content and in examining the way that their platforms are being used. And then many of them are outside of the United States. And so therefore it's very hard to get user information about who posted, who watched, who viewed, and who was participating in that conduct. That makes it incredibly hard to find these children who are being sex trafficked.
Great point.
Yeah.
I want to follow up with the question, Sophia, you were just touching on it about people not necessarily knowing the difference or not knowing that, what this may be. What is the difference between sex trafficking and sex work? And how do advocates and law enforcement differentiate between the two?
Wow, that's such a loaded question. So, the industry of sex work can be legal and illegal. So you can have sex work that's in the pornography business. You can have escorts. You can have it, again, where you're dealing with prostitution. So there's different realms of the sex work industry. And you have several different people that are in the anti-trafficking movement that can fall under different levels. There's some that want to decriminalize it so that, again, women can feel empowered to do this work and they make their own money as opposed to someone else making their money. Again, sex trafficking 100% is somebody else having control of your body to either do labor to make money off of your labor or sexual exploitation, commercial sexual exploitation. And normally sex trafficking 100% is somebody not in control. Sex work, though, if you have conversations with certain pockets, is women consent to being an escort, or they consent to being in the pornography business, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry as well. And so again, it's a loaded question in the sense where you'll get some that says, let's decriminalize all of it so that, again, nobody is quote unquote being trafficked, but that is not the case. There will still be women and men that are vulnerable populations that are manipulated and abused in this particular life. So it's not just as cut and dry as let's make it all legal so they can make more money and we don't have to hold certain people accountable. It's, again, what is right for the person that is being victimized or being utilized for sexual activity and or labor.
Brooke, Becky, from an advocacy law enforcement standpoint, is there any differentiation there in that space?
I think one thing I would add is kind of building on what Sophia said. Sometimes people have agency and choice in these things, and so they may choose a certain line of work and say that's what I want to do, and that's my choice. Sometimes the systems around us influence those choices, and some people have more access and some people have less, and so there may be people that are doing sex work, but they're doing it because they may not have access to the education or the skills or the other things that they need to have the choice to do other things. Sophia talked so poignantly about the fact that she didn't really recognize her own situation until she was well into adulthood. So there may be people that just, don't see any other path or don't recognize that the situation they're in is exploitative until they really understand that it's actually criminal. So, I think we have to consider all of the systems and the, factors that put people in situations where they either are exploited or choose to do sex work and say, hey, is that, contributing to what led them there, or was it their own agency that did?
Becky, that was really good. And if I can piggyback, I want to give an example. So, working in a strip club can be considered a part of the sex work industry. We know in our fight against human trafficking, though, that is also a hub and a hotspot sometimes for women that ultimately can become trafficked. So, again, we have some women that, they say, I'm a stripper, I make good money, I can get myself through college, it helps me take care of my kids, I pay the daycare. Like Becky said, this is what they choose to do. This is a means for them to do it. However, we know certain environments can lead to other activity that is not consensual. And so that's why there's always that fine line when you start talking about the sex work industry about, again, yes, I can consent. I want to do this, I'm getting out there. I need to get through college or whatever the case may be. But then there's others that go. And then because that is kind of a breeding ground as well for other activity that might be transpiring, then we can get women that need to be, assisted in getting out. And we have even part of our council that I facilitate, the Human Trafficking Survivor Leadership Council. We have ladies on that council that work with law enforcement that go in and do stings in strip clubs. To help young ladies that might have gotten caught up in human trafficking. So we know, again, there's just that fine line when it comes to this difference between the two. But again, sex work industry normally can lead to a vulnerable situation for some women and or men to be trafficked.
Well, and I guess what I would want to say about it as well is the buyer, the consumer of the sex work doesn't know whether it's consensual or not consensual. And that's one of the things that's particularly true of what's legal pornography, is that much of it is actually created through human trafficking. And so one of the dangers of this differentiating sex work and implying that that's implying that all pornography and all strip clubs are consenting adults. The danger of that is that it makes it, I think, somewhat harder for the victims in those industries to come out and to outcry about their victimization.
Thank you for making that distinction and noting that not all sex work is consensual or a choice.
That's right. And that's the hard thing about using that term, right? Is because when you're talking about sex work, you're assuming that it's all done with knowing consent. And yet from the consumer, from the outside eye, from, as Sophia said, the cop walking into that strip club who's trying to investigate trafficking and identify victims, you can't, by looking at the actual activity that's happening until you start talking one-on-one to the people engaging in it, can you determine whether or not it's truly voluntary. And there's many who believe that they are doing it voluntarily and through their own autonomy. But once you start asking questions, it's actually that their boyfriend gets all their money, and then the boyfriend makes all the decisions, and someone else is deciding when they work, and someone else is getting the majority of what they're making. And so the line between sex work and sex trafficking is extremely blurry.
Very blurry. We do have an audience question from Deborah Johnson. Deborah asks, how do we get at the root cause? For example, stop demand for those being trafficked. Is there work being done on this beyond laws? Becky, you want to talk more about that?
Sure. I can start with that one. This is the thing that keeps me up at night in this work. I just can't fathom sometimes how a human would do something like this to another human, to feel as if that other person is property or is currency, as Sophia described it, or is subject to their exploitation. It's hard for me to live with that, honestly. So I say, well, what is it about the human condition that makes some people do this to other people? And is that something we can ever solve? I mean, this has been going on probably since humans started walking on the earth. So part of it, we need to educate people, and that's happening. There's an interesting program. Children at Risk is one of the organizations working in this anti-trafficking space, and they actually have worked on programs where folks who used to buy sex online then pose as buyers to intercept other buyers and say, hey, do you realize that person that you're pursuing online is a minor? Can we talk about this and just, try to understand what's going on? So, using people who have actually been a part of these transactions to come alongside others and help make them more aware of what's going on and help make them aware that, especially when it's a young person, that there's no choice in that is exploitation, and that it's illegal and what they're doing is criminal. So I think, programs like that can be really powerful, in ways of educating the public. And then, also just thinking about, again, all the systems that make people not just more vulnerable to exploitation, but make the ones who are pursuing and buying sex feel like it's okay. Like, just what is it about that makes them think that it's okay to buy somebody?
Courtney, that's a very we got some loaded questions today.
Yeah.
Because as long as money, and I'm the realist here, as long as people are making money, it's hard to shut down anything. And we're not just talking about, everyday Joe Schmoes. Again, this goes all the way up. There are people, as we even saw with Mr. Kraft, that are billionaires still participating in trafficking. And then when they get exposed, they get a slap on the wrist and they get to keep going on. So the hard part is it's hard to say, okay, this is the one or two things, the three things we need to do to stop it, because at the end of the day, judges make money. Some officers are making money. Some politicians are making money. Everyday people in gangs and in other facets are making money off of people, and there's no real consequence. And so until there's actual real consequence and accountability to expose and a willingness to lose money, we have this vicious cycle that continues. Again, America, we 400 years plus into this. This is not new to us. And then, like Becky said, it's been since inception. Every major country that you go to or culture that you look at, there's been some form of one entity being a servitude to another. And so again, it's unfortunately, it's a part of this human nature that we have. But again, as long as there is something to gain financially from it, and now in our current time with little to no consequence, it's hard to say that there's any one or two things that can truly just put an end to it.
Yeah.
So like doing these things, and I don't want to be Debbie Downer. So the positive with that is, again, knowing that we have Becky with the data that can kind of get to the whys. We know the where, we know the what, now we get the whys. That can help with strategy and planning. And like Brooke was talking about with the OAG's office, the governor's office, and the prevention task force that we have in Texas, where we got TABC and all of these entities that know that there's some cross-sectionality there. We start nipping in on that because we know the accountability piece is really what's crucial. Holding them accountable is how you help. And then providing survivors resources to where they don't feel vulnerable to go back in or get sucked in that life again. And that they can feel confident to speak up in public and not feel like there'll be retaliation or not feel like their stories won't be heard, they won't be seen, they won't be believed. So it's kind of a combination. And I think we're starting that, but it's going to be a long road. It's a long road. Billions of dollars are made through trafficking worldwide. So it's going to be definitely a long road.
Yeah. Thanks for keeping it real on that point, Sophia. So yes, human trafficking is a lucrative business.
It is.
Yes, we have people like you all working tirelessly to help address the issue. But yeah, there's so many things that are interconnected. So I appreciate you pointing that out. I want to talk about human smuggling and human trafficking. So people often confuse the two. Human smuggling is the business of transporting people illegally across an international border. And given that Texas is close to the US-Mexico border, how is human smuggling related to human trafficking and what issues arise?
So there's definitely a correlation because one of the vulnerabilities for trafficking victims is to not have documentation, to be an undocumented either visa overstayer or entrant into the United States. And so that creates a vulnerability for sex and for labor trafficking that they are going to become victims of one or both. So the tie is that the more of the smuggling, the more illegal entry there is, the more vulnerable people that there are, and the more that we see trafficking in Texas because of the increase of vulnerability.
I'll tack on with that. So there's definitely those relationships, but folks, I think, again, because this is glorified in the movies and in the media, they think that somebody's being trafficked is, snatched from their bedroom and taken away somewhere and sold. And while that happens, and it's quite tragic, it's actually rare that many more instances of trafficking are family related, just as Sophia described her own personal situation, or they may be gang related, or it may be about survival, and it may just be about a person who had no risk factors and no propensity to be exploited, just being groomed by somebody, wrong place, wrong time, and then suddenly, over time finding themselves in the life. So we have to recognize that human smuggling can contribute to the risk for exploitation or trafficking. Trafficking can have a relationship to smuggling, but you can have folks who are smuggled and not trafficked. You can have folks who are trafficked and not smuggled. And in a state as vast and as diverse as Texas, trafficking is happening all over the state. Oftentimes people will think, hey, that is a big problem for Texas. It's a border problem. Well, it is a border problem, and it's also a Central Texas problem, and it's an East Texas problem, and it's a North Texas problem. And it's a problem that, is oftentimes unrelated to smuggling. So I think we have to recognize that the way to get at it is to to use the data that we have, to use the insights that we have, to bring the experts to the table and understand, again, the kind of the why is it happening, why is there vulnerability in certain communities over others, how do we get at that, how do we try to prevent that.
All right, so I want to pull in another question from our audience. It's from Terry St. John. And the ask is, regarding our Texas child welfare system, do we require state welfare administrators to screen for trafficking in their existing caseloads and report all children missing from the state care to law enforcement, or is there a gap in the system?
I can start with that, and glad to have others jump in. So the child welfare, the Department of Family and Protective Services does screen among their cases to determine if individuals are being exploited. But there's a whole network of screening agencies around the state. So child advocacy centers, rape crisis centers, drop-in centers, emergency shelters, different types of programs that work with vulnerable youth or vulnerable adults, school districts, so there's this network of an increasing network of professionals who are screening and helping to identify victims of trafficking. So child welfare certainly bears a key responsibility here, and because they are a huge part of a system that is dealing with kids who are being abused, they're going to be a front line of defense for that. But we have to recognize they're not the only ones out there. They also have a really tough job in terms of reach and access to individuals, and that we have to keep building this network of other providers and other experts who can be trained and look for the signs and use the assessment tools and the screening tools that we have to help identify folks and then get them into the right type of care.
This really is all hands on deck.
It is. And to back up what Becky said, I used to work for DFPS up until last year. And in 2017, I believe they actually created a separate division dedicated to human trafficking. Blanca is over that. And it specifically was because they started to see, like, wait a minute, a lot of our vulnerable, which is foster youth, that again, can sometimes fall through the cracks. We also have it to where, again, those that are already being abused at home, that's another vulnerable population that can be lured into the life, or again, be susceptible through familial trafficking or Romeo pimps. And so they created their own division and really made the Be the One was something that was mandatory for all of us, even if we weren't dealing directly with children. I was on the prevention side, so I wasn't dealing directly with the children, but every member of that staff was mandated to watch Be the One and to do that training. And that's how seriously they took it, so that they can have another lens. Because in the past, they weren't looking for trafficking. They were looking for physical signs of abuse and or neglect. And so now they've coupled that to say, okay, here are some additional signs that we might have missed in the past because we were looking for more straightforward abuse or neglect as far as their care. And so again, there's a lot of agencies are really starting to notice that there's a lot of crossing some of these red flags and barriers through the See It tool. Oh, well, this is something now we can ask and have that conversation differently to pull out information that can help really save some of these children, or at least give the families resources that they need.
Okay. I want to read this. We got another question in from the audience, and I think they're commenting on something we're all feeling about all of you and everyone doing this work. It says, this is lifelong work. This question is from Devin Donovan. It says, this is lifelong work, and I applaud all who are dedicated to the change. Question on fulfillment. Is it more fulfilling on an individual basis, or is there more joy from making legislative changes? Should the attention be more on one or the other?
That's a wonderful question. I'm going to start with that as a survivor, because it's very personal for me. I think the fulfillment for me was when I finally felt comfortable speaking my truth, without any shame, without any guilt, because sometimes you have survivor's guilt when you get out and you see that there's others still dealing with that. And then it's been very gratifying to be a part of the legislative process and being educated about how important that is, that the laws are very, very important. And I think initially, sometimes you don't realize that if you're in it, you're just trying to get out, you're trying to survive, you want to be healthy and whole. And then you're like, okay, I want to be part of the solution. I'm going to tell my story. And yes, people need to hear the story, put a face to it, and be able to see that you can get out and thrive. But you also need to realize the importance about the laws that are made. And again, as Brooke was talking about, like getting to the fact that we need to hold people accountable. And again, Texas being a part of that trend setting, as I want to say, to make it a felony is monumental. And it really speaks volumes to where any of us that has been a part of legislation can really be proud that we've made some type of impact. And again, especially as a woman of color for myself, I think it's very, very important for others that are minorities to see a woman of color that is out and thriving. And so it's fulfilling to put myself out there to a certain degree, hopefully so that somebody can be inspired to break free, to hashtag get loud, get out, or again, speak their truth and live their truth without any type of guilt and shame.
Absolutely.
I love that. I love that. Thank you, Sophia.
I'll jump in here too. I love this question, and it's super personal for me too. I'm kind of the newbie here among the three of us in terms of being in this work. I spent most of my adult life at IBM doing corporate technology work. Came to Allies actually through a fellowship in the Leadership Austen program. I was supposed to be there for a year. 3 years later, I'm still there. I couldn't leave after the fellowship was up. And I don't work directly with victims and survivors. Every so often, I get to encounter that as part of the work that we do, but I work in data and tech. So I'm kind of behind the scenes with the bits and the bytes, and then, understanding, getting feedback from survivors and professionals who do the work. So, I like to say the universe put me here. Like there was a whole path of things I did throughout my life. Never had this as a destination or a part of that journey, but I look back and think, all the things that I did contributed to my being able to be in this fight and use the skills that I have and use the experiences that I've had to try to make a dent. So for me, it's not about, working with one individual or working on policy or whatever. I see data as a tool that will inform others who are doing that direct work to do it better and to be better informed about it, and hopefully, be making better decisions or influencing policy and budget and law in a way that, has a positive outcome for survivors.
Brooke, anything you want to add?
No, I mean, I agree. It would be hard to choose which is more fulfilling. I will say that probably in the end, the reason I do it is for the relationship that I get to make as I'm prosecuting a case with the victim. And that's probably what hits that heart, hits that reason to keep going back, reason to keep fighting. It's a hard fight. We need all the people we can get to join the fight, because it's a hard one.
So I have a follow-up question for you all. And this is more so geared towards the survivor. How can we help provide safe spaces for survivors to share their stories, be heard, and be believed?
Well, to start off, this is one, because you're allowing a place for us, and I say us because I represent the us as survivors, to unapologetically speak our truth. There's no censorship in me telling what portion of my story I want, or again, being able to advocate and really articulate the importance of everybody has a part to play in this. And if it's just the one life that you're able to impact, it can have a ripple effect on thousands of lives and make an impact in society worth millions of dollars. And I always speak this truth because I'm now the facilitator for the Human Trafficking Survivor Leadership Council, which is sponsored through the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault. And we also partner with the Jensen Project and the Governor's Office against the child sex trafficking team. And what this has allowed us to do is there's up to 13 of us that are survivors throughout the state of Texas that have a voice. We all have different lived experiences in this field, but we're more than just that lived experiences. Many of us have master's degrees, doctorates, social workers, nurses, and we're able to bring all of that to the table and be a voice for so many of those. I know the UT study said 313, but we know that is a gross underestimate of actually how many victims are in the state at any given time. Most of them don't even self-identify, so it would have been hard for you to identify them. But again, we know still that's hundreds of thousands of people that are being victimized every single day. That wasn't just an annual, that's every single day. And so again, having a space like the council, having a space like these media platforms, having spaces like Allies Against Slavery, which they actually have work groups that meet to deal with youth and adult trafficking, to deal with labor and sex trafficking. They have these platforms. So being able to continue to have platforms that allow us to have a voice unapologetically, because we all have different personalities and different experiences. But again, when you go from trauma to triumph, that is something to really declare and be proud of, especially as a survivor. So again, thank you so much for allowing this to be a topic, because some people won't take it on. Some people look at it as political. It can be tough, but it's necessary if we want to continue to help those that are being victimized.
Thank you for that, Sophia.
You. And I know we're getting close to our call to action. There's just one question from the audience that I think is important to get out that I want to see if we can address real quick. It's from Terry St. John. What existing programs are designed for victim reintegration into building a normal life? For anyone that's experiencing this right now, what's out there for them?
So for anyone who's experiencing, my first piece of advice would be to call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. They have a list of all the services available region by region. So that would be something, that I would say it would be a first step for self-identification. Texas is filled with nonprofit organizations that are working on this very issue, that are working on all of the wraparound services that our victims need to become reintegrated, to become the survivors of sexual or labor trafficking. And so reaching out, finding that organization, making that first step to find out what the specific need is and where the specific need filler is, I would say would be the very first step.
That's really good. And I want to add to that really quickly, Becky. And you can call the hotline. The text number that is there is 233-733. So for those that aren't as apt to call the 800 number, which is 888-373. 7388. You can do the 233-733 text message. Again, even if you feel as though there might be something going on, you can actually report things anonymously through that area, no matter where you are, and they'll direct it to local law enforcement, which is great. But we have even local resources here in the Austin area, like the Magdalene House. They have a great program to help integrate females that have been sex trafficked. Red Oak is another one. Even though they don't specifically deal, quote unquote, with human trafficking, but Safe Alliance is another place for those that have been in domestic violence or sexual assault circumstances. So there are some local, right here in Austin, entities that actually really work on helping those that have been trafficked. But again, texting 233-733 is a really easy, quick way for you to be able to, again, get loud, get out if you have, or you're looking for resources. Or again, if you want to report something you're seeing, it's better to report and be wrong than not to report and been right. So again, that's just another way, safe space that you can be able to do that.
Yeah, and the
Thank
one
you.
thing I was going to add is that here in Central Texas, we have an organization called the Central Texas Coalition Against Human Trafficking, CTCAHT. It's a mouthful, but you can Google that, and you'll see all of the participating organizations here in the local area that are a part of that work. All over the state, there are anti-trafficking coalitions that are operating. So if you're tuning in today from another part of Texas or even other states, many communities have built anti-trafficking coalitions, and those are a great resource to figure out, who's doing the work, where the resources and the services are, and how to get involved.
All right, that's awesome. Thank y'all for sharing that.
Thank you for that. So I want to make sure we have time for our call to action. So today we talked a lot about lived experience and resources to combat human trafficking and what human trafficking looks like in our region. And so for each of you on this call to action, what can viewers do in their everyday lives to become more aware that human trafficking exists and to be a part of the solution to stop human trafficking in their communities?
Okay, I'll start on that. And I do want to make a correction. That number for the human trafficking hotline is 888-373-7888. So just in case I got that wrong last time, I want to make sure that I clarified that for those that, again, want to call and find out about resources. Becky named a really great resources to go and find all of the local entities. One of the things I always say is volunteer to learn. A lot of those organizations, once you go and find out about local organizations and coalitions that are in your area, being able to just volunteer helps you to, one, get boots on the ground, to learn a little bit more specifically about resources that are available in your community. You'll get more in-depth training about what it looks like. I do encourage you all to take the advice that Brooke gave to go to the OAG's office and watch Be the One. It's a phenomenal, very powerful video. And again, learning what it looks like so that you can be able to better report if you see something. But also to have those conversations. There's a statistic out there that says about 45% of those that are affected by domestic violence, sexual assault, and or trafficking, they go to family and friends first. They don't go immediately to law enforcement. And then a next percentage is church, and then they go to law enforcement. So what that means is it's incumbent upon you just to learn so you can know how to have those conversations, how to support someone that potentially comes to you. You don't have to be the expert. You don't have to go out and save the world, but being able to have empathy and to provide them with where they potentially can go, or even knowing that text number, 233-733, to give them so that they can reach out if they need to, is a huge, huge help.
Brooke or Becky?
I'm sure I would say, to echo what Sophia said, even if you're not going to volunteer, at least find that reputable human trafficking organization in your area. One of the things that well-meaning people can do that actually causes trouble is they reshare some of the false news reports that go across Facebook or their social media. So they continue to call law enforcement on hoaxes, and they see something in their Facebook thread that's unverified, and they keep resharing it, and it causes police offices to become inundated with false calls. So find that reputable organization. If you're not going to volunteer, at least make sure you are following them on your social media so that you are not spreading misinformation, because that's it's hard enough to get the word out about how to identify victims and what victims should do if they come forward. It's even worse when we're crowding up that information with false information. So find someone reputable and follow them on social media.
Thank you. Becky?
Yeah, I would just say what they both said, and also just to have the conversations with the people in your life. If you're a parent and it's your kids, or you have other children in your life, or you're a teacher, or if there are other adults in your life, or you're talking about the whatever's in the news, the Epstein or whatever. Bring in the facts, so as Brooke said, you're not caught up in some of the falsehoods that are getting spread, but also, talk about the human dignity, talk about the element of dignity and the way that we treat each other as humans and the way that we should not. No one chooses to be trafficked. No one chooses to be raped. Nobody chooses to be exploited. This is never a choice. And so it's about power and control and vulnerability. So let's have those conversations with each other and talk about what that means and how it affects us. And, one by one, you can kind of chip away at that with at least the people around you, and maybe that spreads to a few more as we go.
Thank you all for those call to actions. Appreciate that.
This has been so informative. We really appreciate all of you. Thank you, Becky Austen, Brooke Grona-Robb, and Sophia A Strother for sharing your experiences and expertise on human trafficking in Central Texas.
And thank you to our audience. We hope you'll join us in June. The topic will be employee hiring, retention, and trends. So enjoy the rest of your day and see you next month.